Hello, I'm Alison Brackenbury, and the first thing I must do is apologise for the hat. It's my old gardening hat, which I wear in the small garden, in the relentless sun, in our cruelly changed climate. When my COVID booster kicks in, I hope to go and see my young hairdresser and find out all about her new cat. This may give you some idea of my preoccupations. I'm sitting at sunrise in a small front room, in a small house in a Gloucestershire town, inland, where I've lived for over 40 years. You may hear my neighbours whizzing past in builders' vans, or the current old cat crashing round the house. I apologise. This is the world from which my poems come, the world in which I think we all live. Normally I script everything with terrified rigour, but I thought today I would simply sit in the rising sun, glancing occasionally at a hopeful list, and I would talk to you about my current book, my new book, Thorpeness, and the history and the hinterland behind it. Although I'm now in Gloucestershire, I was born in Lincolnshire, a North Midland county, very close to the coast. I come from a long line of servants and skilled farm workers. My father was a ploughboy who started work at 14. My mother was a very dedicated village teacher. This is clearly an unusual background. I think many poets have what I would call benevolently odd lives, and I've managed a fairly odd one. After university, I worked in a technical college library. After my daughter was born, I became a rather erratic accounts clerk. But for 23 years, I worked in my husband's small family business. I was 50% of the workforce, doing manual work as a metal finisher in a boiler suit. I still have the boiler suit, but I have happily been retired for quite a while. I think all of this fed into my poetry. There's a fascinating dilemma that if you have a life that yields many subjects, you have a lot to write about. I should add that although I lived in a town, we were always awash with animals. If you're thinking of keeping 6 cats, I would recommend against it. But it may be, of course, like us, you'll have 3 turn up in a fortnight, escaping death or starvation. I also kept unaffordable, shaggy, loyal horses on a farm up on the hills. But the price of all this, the long hours of work, being bound up with my animals, meant that I didn't engage with the public life of poetry for over 20 years, although I went on writing. Thorpeness is my 10th collection. The one thing I do regret is that I feel I didn't do enough to get poetry out into the wider world, which we all know is there. I've lived all my life amongst people who don't read poetry, but I know that when they stumble across a poem, they often value it or remember it. So I do honour everyone who is letting poetry drift out, going under the poetry fence into that big, wide world. I think that reading is absolutely essential for writing. I also know I've never done enough of it, and that is still true, despite the piles of excellent books on my desk. But I can commend to you 2 excellent ones which I have read recently. One is Inhale Exile by Abir Amir. This speaks of the history of her Iraqi family. It has a wonderful poem about a heroic and ordinary man who is both hero and, as she says with capitals, the world's worst postman. It's a very moving and very funny poem. She also writes beautifully about food and people's longing for it. The tastes may be different, the common urge is, I think, the same. The second book I would recommend is Hannah Lowe's Kids, about young people in London, including Hannah herself. It's compassionate, tactful, It's full of the music of names, and it's superbly written. Do read it. I'm sitting at a desk, a big, solid wooden desk. It's said to have come from a farm, which I call the Lost Farm. The desk probably belonged to my grandmother's grandmother, Eliza Reed. The farm wasn't hers, it was probably rented. Her husband died in the prime of life, probably from a farming accident. I'll try and show you a photograph. Amazingly, this must be from the 1860s or before, because that is when he died, and he looks remarkably like my father. But Eliza did not leave the farm. She stayed there for 30 years. A brick house out in that mysterious marshland near the Lincolnshire coast, to which I'm still so drawn. And I think the house was a kind of ark for all kinds of people who worked for her and lived with her. This is a photograph of Eliza with her little daughter, Louisa, my grandmother's mother, but they look stricken. I think it was soon after the death of her husband. Eliza left other things. She gave a great family Bible to my grandmother, who was called Dorothy Eliza, and she left a locket with her picture and her husband's. I'll try to wave that at you. Her husband's picture is faded almost to nothing. I think there are old accounts on the back of that bit of paper. I think Eliza probably did the farm accounts at this desk. But I was shocked and saddened to find recently that Eliza died, despite the desk, the lost farm, the gilt locket, that she died in a workhouse. She may not have been totally destitute. She may have gone there for medical treatment because she wasn't rich enough to pay for a private nurse at home, and there were no proper hospitals. The medical treatment was probably not very good. I've already written about the other side of my Lincolnshire family, my grandfather's family. I've written about his mother, Mary Brackenbury, because I know her words. She too lost a husband in the prime of life to pneumonia, no antibiotics, which, by the way, we will lose again if we go on using too many, especially on intensive farms. After her husband's death, Mary was not given enough money by the parish board to keep herself and her children, and it's known that she cried to them, "How am I to live?" She did get by endless work, but she died before she was 50, the family believe, of hard work. And that cry of Mary's, "How am I to live?" I think underlies a lot of what I still write. Both my grandmothers fed their neighbours' children. I honestly think they would weep to know that I am still giving tins to food banks. The first poem, Thorpeness, starts in the country, in Gloucestershire, in a beechwood with green hollows. But this was not always a peaceful place. It was a hill fort, and most of these hill forts were failures, mistakes by the leaders. They were overrun, almost everyone died. And the poem ends with a reference to our lost leader's last lying, which tumbled us all in the ditch. There are many ditches to think of. You will think of your own. And perhaps the deepest is the state of our battered planet. There is a poem in Thorpeness about the Apollo 1968 mission, which of course I remember. It produced that glowing picture of our blue Earth. It also sent the astronauts round the other side of the moon. The poem ends, "I never dreamed that we would reach such dark. But the sun is coming up, and Thorpeness is not a miserable or unhappy book, partly because of the people in it, for the descendants of these farmers and shepherds, whom I knew, were cheerful and courageous people, and they're in my book. There's my grandfather, Fred the shepherd. Let me find the photograph of him with a lamb under each arm. There he is, with a far better version of the hat. But there's a whole section of poems too, about that little girl who was given the family Bible, Dorothy Eliza Barnes, my grandmother, whom her family called Dot. She'd been a professional cook. She was a wonderful cook. This may be the only poetry book in which you can get a complete recipe within a poem for a steamed pudding. But this was really a way, of course, of talking about her life, her generosity, her neighbourliness. And really, what is food about? I have a poem which describes spending a day with Dot when I was pretty young. And it ends, "I never guessed that you were old. You marched home, cooked huge tea. The folds, muddy as love, the Humber rolled, as we climbed Hawkstow Hill." And, as well as the people, of course, there are animals, the animals my family loved. As one poem says, Fred, my grandfather, who already got up before sunrise to see to the sheep, would get up still earlier in the summer so he could watch the young badgers play. I haven't got badgers in this book, but I've got a stag in the headlights and a water vole in endless ripple in a pond which is now lost. But there's hope with these animals too. I have a poem about a kingfisher, and when I wrote the poem, I had seen kingfishers, but only twice, and not near my present town home. And the poem ends, "When the drab days unwind you, do not put streams behind you. Wait for the light to blind you." And what I didn't know when I wrote this was that I would see a kingfisher again near my home in the half-despoiled greenbelt over a murky stream. I should explain, by the way, that the name Thorpeness is a place name on the east coast, not Eliza's country, further south than Suffolk. It was a place near Aldborough, where I go each year, a place I always meant to go to, but somehow never reached. I think we all have a Thorpeness. Poets are often asked now to summarise their own books, which is a privilege and a painfully difficult thing to do. Never one to pass over a little alliteration. The first thing I came up with was that on the way to Thorpeness, there was warning, warmth, and wonder. But I now think too that this is a book from a borderland. It's a book between country and town. It's a book between generations. And there are some poems in there from the difficult times we've all just been through. So I think the poem I would like to read to you last is a poem from that time. I think that many of us recently discovered a small green kingdom very close to our homes. I spent a lot of time on a footpath in a field just outside Cheltenham. Here I found the shells of oysters, a cheap food in Victorian England. And I found willow pattern, the china which tells the story of two lovers, one rich, one poor. After death, the lovers are reunited as birds. The poem is called Willow Pattern. Town's edge, a lane, a bridge, a field marched by the battered stalks of maize, lit by hills broad as the moon. The cracks in April's clay will yield rich oyster shells to feed poor days, pipes, pig skulls. Best we find soon smashed pottery. And most is blue, slipped from quick hands, a child's, a maid's, to floor, were harsh words spoken. I brush a latticed rim, while you scoop one white scrap, whose two bluebirds, smudged lovers, soar, unbroken. Thank you very much for watching.